Okay. For everybody who's watching this on recording, we're happy to get this quarter's club started here. We have Clay Mauritson, Mauritson Wines. It's a winery that Pierce and I went to in 2018, and Zinfandel is honestly kind of a first love of mine coming into the wine. I'm not really sure how that happened, but that is how it happened. And I think Mauritson does Zin about as well as anybody down there, and that the area he's going to kind of talk us through, and the wines that he'll walk us through, I think will kind of maybe hopefully persuade you over to some of the reasons that I like Zinfandel. So I guess without further ado here, I'll let Clay kind of jump into maybe the history of Mauritson, and then how he got started there, or how he decided to continue down that road with the winery.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys so much for having me. It's certainly an honor. I love when I hear that people love Zinfandel that are in the industry. That means a lot to me, and I appreciate the nod. I agree. I think we make some of the best Zinfandels around, but it means a lot more coming from someone else when they say it. I will give you some background on myself and my family, because I think it gives you a much better understanding of why I get out of bed every morning. Truth be told, I was a marketing major and finance minor in college. Winemaking I learned after the fact. And marketing 101, right, is that every product has a what, every product has a how, and what separates those is why. Why do we do what we do? And for me, what gets me out of bed every morning is the incredible family legacy that my family has, and really an intense desire to build upon our existing legacy. My family is one of the oldest grape growing families in all of California. We homesteaded our original piece of property back in 1868. So for all you math whizzes following around, I think that gives us about 153 years of farming. But the truth is, for the last 130 years, basically, we have just been farmers. We had always grown grapes, but grapes were not the major source of income for us. We raised merino sheep for wool. We did row crops, stone fruit, basically whatever we had to do to put food on the family's table. My ancestors were lucky enough to homestead a piece of property, and it's pretty hard to think about that now, that there was still land available for homesteading in Sonoma County, because it's such a desirable place to be. But in the 1860s, it was the wild, wild west. And so we homesteaded property and continued to homestead what we could, and then purchased neighboring properties. And our estate grew to about 4,000 acres by the turn of the last century. And before you start feeling sorry for me that I was raised in a family that has 4,000 acres, I'm going to fast forward to 1968. And in 1968, we lost 3,300 acres of our property to eminent domain. And the truth is, we lost everything. I mean, we lost all of the vineyard land that we are farming. We lost the other hundreds of acres that were in row crops and stone fruit and trees. We lost my grandparents' home, my great-grandparents' home, all the improvements that it took to raise 1,000 head of livestock. We basically lost everything. And yes, we were left with 700 acres of the original ranch, but that was at the top of the hills, land that we thought was really, invaluable. And, go back to this notion that my family was farmers. And I remember asking my grandfather one time how we got through the Great Depression. And he said, son, we were so poor, we didn't know there was a depression. And, again, we were just people that lived off the land. You grew whatever you needed to grow to survive. So all of a sudden we lose our property to eminent domain. And, it was devastating. There's no way to underscore it, but all we had ever known was farming. And yes, we were paid, but we were paid about 9 cents on the dollar. And without going into the really gory details, we could afford to buy 90 acres of prunes in Alexander Valley and a house in Hillsburg, and with everything that we lost. It was a net loss of 3,200 acres and an entire way of life. But when we bought that 90 acres of prunes, we immediately pulled the prunes out and started planting vineyard. And, it's what we knew. And all we knew how to do was farm. Turns out that 1968 was a pretty good year to put all of your eggs in the vineyard basket. This little tiny winery called Robert Mondavi opened its doors in 68. And yes, I know the winery started in 66, but when you think about that pivotal change in our industry, from them opening that tasting room and really showpiece winery. I think we can all agree it forever changed the trajectory of American wine, not just California wine. So funny story, we actually planted, and I'll come back to this, of that 90 acres we planted in Alexander Valley, I think 25 acres was planted to Pinot. There was Gamay Noir, and I think maybe a little bit of Cabernet. And the Cabernet was really by luck. The Pinot Noir was because a sparkling wine house gave us a planting contract to grow, Pinot Noir for sparkling wine. But it really underscores my family's approach to farming. We were grape growers, not wine growers. So fast forward to me and my siblings' generation, we love to refer to our childhood more like an indentured servitude than a normal childhood. I spent every waking moment that I was not in school or playing sports out there picking grapes and pruning vines, tying vines, whatever it took to get the job done. I'm pretty sure that my parents believed in the adage that the more kids you had just meant the cheaper the labor force, because we were by and large terms the labor force. It's no coincidence that me and all my brothers ended up playing college sports, because literally we did every sport under the sun just so we didn't have to work in the vineyards. And it obviously worked out well for us. I am without a doubt the black sheep of the family. All three of my brothers went off and got viticulture degrees with the sole intent of coming back and working in the family business. And I wanted to get the hell out of the family business. I thought I wanted to be the next Jerry Maguire. I went to school to study marketing and finance. I really went to school to play football and ended up getting a couple of degrees. And I mentioned football because in a very weird way, football is what got me back into the wine business. I was really fortunate to play on some great teams. I got to play in the Rose Bowl. I played in the Cotton Bowl. And in my senior year, I had a very severe shoulder injury, which ended my playing career instantaneously. And I really wanted to get out of the rain in Oregon and come back down to California for a summer, because there's no such thing as a summer break as a Division I athlete. You stay and you train year round. So literally, I have my arms in a sling from surgery. I just finished finals. I drive home on Friday night. Saturday morning, I'm sitting on the couch, and I hadn't seen anyone in my family yet. My dad had probably been up at work for hours already. And he walks back in the house, and the first words out of his mouth were not, "Welcome home, son. It's great to see you." The first words out of his mouth were verbatim, "I sure as hell hope you don't plan on sitting on my couch all summer long." So being the smart ass of the family that I was, I looked at him and I said, "Well, I sure hope you don't plan on me sitting on a tractor all summer long." And he made it very clear in no uncertain terms, if I was going to live under his roof, I was going to have a job that summer. And God's honest truth, I thought to myself, what is the most spiteful thing I can do, but still have a roof over my head? And as crazy as it may sound, the most spiteful thing that I could have done was to go to work at a winery. For 5 generations, my family had sold grapes to wineries. And you gotta understand this, when I was in this situation, this was in the mid 90s, but certainly all of the decades leading up to that, it was a pretty antagonistic relationship between a grower and a winery. And maybe to some extent it still is today. A grower simply wants to get paid as much as they can for their fruit. And a winery pretty much wants to pay as little as they have to get that fruit. And so I had heard from my grandfather and my father after him about how the wineries were always beating us up over pricing, or beating us up over quality parameters, or hanging the fruit out. So what do? I go to work at a winery just to piss my dad off. And to say that it ignited a spark that started a fire would be a massive understatement. As crazy as it sounds, I never connected the dots between what my family did for a living and what we enjoyed on our dinner table every night. And you got to understand, when you walk in my parents' house, there was a huge plaque on the wall right when you walked in that said, "A dinner without wine is like a day without sunshine." And we lived and breathed that mantra. And I watched my grandfather and my dad, and then me and my siblings all work in the vineyards, but there was this huge void in between. And I had visited probably 50 different wineries with my dad, but I never connected the dots. Now, all of a sudden, I'm doing an internship in college to piss my dad off, and the light bulb just went on. And I absolutely fell in love with that side of the industry. Having degrees in marketing and finance, I thought that maybe I would want to work on the sales and marketing side of the industry. So when I graduated from college, I went back to school, obviously, finished my degrees, and applied for a whole bunch of sales and marketing positions at wineries. And maybe it was the football and my overconfidence, but I just assumed that all those, remarks about needing 10 years of, industry experience didn't apply to me. So I wasn't afraid to apply for a vice president of sales position. Well, as you can imagine, any call back I got was, someone chuckling on the other end. And so I figured I needed to change my course of action. I ended up taking an entry level position in the cellar. And when I say entry level, I wasn't a cellar lead. I certainly wasn't an enologist or assistant winemaker. I was just a cellar hand. And I took that job simply thinking if I can get my foot in the door at a winery, I'll work my way up into that dream sales and marketing job. I was getting paid $11 an hour. Here I had 2 degrees out of college, dragging hoses around a cellar. And literally within 2 weeks of taking that job, I knew what I wanted to do the rest of my life. I absolutely fell in love with the winemaking side of the industry. I fell in love with that seamless blend of art and science. And, if you were to sum up for me, what I truly love about winemaking, that's it right there, is there are so few vocations in the world that just seamlessly put those two things together. So I was hooked. I also realized that this is what I wanted to do the rest of my life. I had some deficiencies in my education. So this is back in the mid 1990s, remember, and UC Davis was marketing what they called an online course. And what online meant was that you registered through email. But to give you an idea of how dated this is, it was a certificate course. So you didn't have to attend lectures. You didn't have to do that. They sent you all the lectures, not on CD, certainly not in digital file, on VHS tapes. So I still have this massive box of VHS tapes. You got to watch all the lectures, and then you just had to commute to take exams. So it was a great vehicle for me to strengthen my, just understanding of winemaking, of enology, of the chemistry of it. And I think, truth be told, like most of us, that background information is invaluable, but the end of the day, we end up using about 90% of what we learn hands-on and what we learn from other winemakers. So I was continued to work at the winery that I was at while I was doing my coursework at Davis. I've had a chance to work at a couple other amazing wineries in Sonoma County, and very quickly started looking around thinking, what in the hell is my family doing? We own some of the greatest vineyards in Sonoma County. Why are we selling all this fruit to other wineries? So I went to my parents with this great idea that, we should start making our own wines. And I think I was maybe 22, 23, probably 23 at the time. And literally, I think my dad's response was, were you sure it wasn't head injury that ended your playing career and not a shoulder injury? I mean, my parents just reaffirmed my position as the black sheep in the family. They thought I was absolutely nuts, had absolutely no interest in going into the wine business. And within 9 months of that initial conversation, some interesting things started to take shape in the industry. And today, when we hear about, corporatization or commoditization in the industry, we know exactly what that means. We know that a publicly traded entity has bought a family winery, or one of the really big family-owned operations like Gallo or Kendall Jackson maybe has bought a family-owned winery. Well, back in the mid-1990s, we didn't know what that meant. We didn't know what the terms meant, and we really didn't know what it meant for the long term for independent high-end grape growers. And what we found out really quickly is that it's not a good thing. What makes wine so special, and I'll probably hit on this later tonight, is the simple fact that it tells you a story of place and time. And I always try and let this, really sink in for myself on a daily basis. When we think about all the things that we consume, the liquids we put in our body, the proteins, the vegetables, the fruits, how many things that we consume do we know that story of when and where? And that's what makes wine so special. So what gets really scary is when you have a publicly traded corporation that buys a winery and they want to commoditize it. They don't want it to be about time and place anymore. They want it to be about ROI. And that's just the way it goes. When you're publicly traded, you have an obligation to your shareholders. If you're Kendall Jackson or Gallo, which are the largest vineyard owners in the state of California, when you buy a brand, you don't want the grape contracts. You have your own vineyards. That's how you create profitability. And that's just the way it is. So all of a sudden, these 3 very prominent wineries, including the one that I was working at, got purchased by large corporations within 9 months of that crazy conversation with my parents. And the first thing that happened is all the grape contracts got canceled. And so to try and make a long story short, all of a sudden my crazy ass idea of us starting to make our own wines didn't seem quite so crazy. And so 23 years ago, my parents agreed to co-sign a loan for me, which is most important because I had to be able to afford to buy the grapes from them. and then sell me some grapes. And we started making our first ever wines from our vineyard. So that is my poor attempt at an elevator speech. My response is I like to take the stairs, so I'm not good at elevators anyways.
No, that's great. That's a great story. So how were those first couple vintages? Good, bad, scared?
It's funny. Our first vintage was 98, which was not considered to be a great vintage in California. And to this day, I think it's probably one of the most expressive Zins I ever made. My winemaking experience was really varied. I worked in larger wineries, really, really high, incredible wineries. I cut my teeth at Kenwood Vineyards forever. That will be, my mentors were there. And this was back when Kenwood was a family-owned business. I worked at Jordan. I worked at Dry Creek Vineyards. I worked at Taft Street. And Taft Street was really a custom crush facility at that point. They made a little bit of wine, but they did more custom crush. But they did custom crush for people like Mary Edwards, for Eric Sussman with Radio Coteau, W.H. Smith, Carol Shelton. I mean, there were all these really incredible wines being made in this facility. And that's where I was making my wines to start, because we didn't, I didn't even have the money to buy grapes. I had to borrow money to buy grapes. So I certainly didn't have the money to build a winery. So we leased space at a custom crush facility. So I had this weird, winemaking experience where I worked at larger wineries that truly made great wines, but it was really safe winemaking. And then I go to this facility that was largely Pinot Noir producers, that was doing everything in open tops. Everything was native ferments. And it was a totally different experience than I was used to. And so, yes, that first wine probably had a little bit higher VA than it should, because, I did it native and, probably got a little away from me up front. But it really put us on the map. I mean, we made an outstanding wine in 98. The 99 was stunning. It was very emblematic of what we would evolve into, being really structured, balanced Zinfandels. 2000 was probably the toughest vintage, because that was my first super problematic vintage when all the weight was on my shoulders. It was a really hot growing season. Not only was it warm overall temperatures, but we had some crazy heat spikes. So we had to deal with a tremendous amount of dehydration, compromised fruit. So, every year's a learning experience, right? And we just keep getting better and better.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess maybe that's a good transition into maybe let's talk about Zinfandel. It's obviously, I guess, would be called the signature grape of California in many ways, even though maybe that falls to Cal in some ways now. But it's not a grape that we traditionally grow well in Washington for various reasons. So maybe people up here aren't quite as familiar with the vineyard practices or how Zinfandel reacts in the vineyard or in the winery.
Well, the first thing that I love to, chide my Pinot Noir brethren on is, I don't care what anyone's told you. Anyone who has tried to tell you that Pinot Noir is the most difficult wine to make has simply never made Zinfandel. And I make them both. You guys know that. You've been to the winery. I can speak from a place of experience. Zinfandel is an absolute bastard of a grape. I mean, it truly is. It's big berried, it's thin skinned, it has a very unique bunch morphology, from the fact that it has the shoulder that can be 50% of the size of the primary bunch, to the fact that it has uneven pedestal and peduncle lengths. But there are so many inherent challenges with it. And the biggest challenge is that as a varietal, it ripens unevenly. And so it doesn't mean that you're going to like Zinfandel any better or worse. We like what we like. I mean, that's the subjectiveness of wine, is really the beauty of it. But what I can tell you is that when you can make a varietally correct, balanced, structured Zinfandel, that is an infinitely greater accomplishment than doing that with other varietals. I don't think making a great Zin is any different than making a great Cabernet or making a great Pinot Noir. It starts with planting the right varietal in the perfect terroir. And then, you get into all the human elements of it, right? Basically us not screwing it up as human beings. And there's a lot of decisions that we have to make to help that vineyard site live up to its full potential. But with Zin, I just think there's so much more that goes into it on the farming side. And certainly there's a lot more risk on the winemaking side. I'm going to brag about my youngest brother for a second. All three of my brothers, as I mentioned, have viticulture degrees, and they run the vineyard side of the operations now. My youngest brother has his master's degree in viticulture and wrote his master's thesis on qualitative analysis of quantity yields as a function of berry size in the Zinfandel grape. So if anyone's looking for, yeah. Yeah, I'm telling you, man, and I'm paraphrasing it. Trust me, that is paraphrasing his thesis. And to try and not get too deep in the weeds, people, there's a lot of variables we can't control in farming. While we can control how much water we put into a vineyard, we can't control what the soil does with that, and we certainly can't control atmospheric water. And so while water you might think would be the first variable you would want to tweak to control berry size, he wanted to see if he can control berry size through different pruning methods. And so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but to make a long story short, he was able to achieve about a 7% reduction in berry size through certain pruning methods. And then as a contrast to that, he really wanted to just reduce overall yields to show that as a contrast, meaning if we have a 400% reduction in yield versus a 7% reduction in berry size, which one has a greater impact on qualitative measures? Well, it turns out that neither one of those correlate as strongly to qualitative metrics as homogenization of ripening in Zinfandel. And it ended up being a fairly simple tactic, meaning that you had to take off the shoulder of the Zinfandel bunch. And at first glance, it doesn't really make sense. At second glance, you're kind of like, well, holy shit, how did we not figure this out earlier? Because of the bunch morphology, that shoulder was actually dividing carbohydrate transfer. So that was the first issue. So you're getting, basically an unequal, that's the word, not unequal carbohydrate transfer to the primary bunch and shoulder. But secondarily, and I think probably more easily understandable, is you have the shoulder that sits on top of the primary bunch that is often 50% of the size of the primary bunch. So you're completely, limiting sun exposure, limiting wind exposure on both aspects of those bunches. And so by taking that off and getting homogenization and ripening, that correlated much stronger to quality. And, again, how do you objectively say what quality is? So we were using things that we can measure, like anthocyanin, like tannin, because we all know that correlates to quality. And long story short, that is how we farm every single one of our Zinfandel blocks, is we take the shoulders off. We take some off at different times. It becomes a very expensive proposition. Our hard cost on a per acre basis to remove the shoulders is about $1,500 per acre. And a lot of it has to do with timing. You want to do it after bunch closure, so it's almost more like a surgical procedure, because you're going in and lifting up the shoulder and clipping it off. You're not just taking off a secondary bunch on the shoot. And then secondarily, your biggest cost is your opportunity cost, because you're often throwing 25 to 30% of your fruit on the ground when you're removing that shoulder. So it gives us a huge head start in making the style of Zinfandel that we do, to have that quality, to get homogenization and ripening. And, things that I know you guys will understand, and maybe, hopefully your consumers understand, is that, ripening is a converse relationship, right? As our sugars go up, our acids drop. Well, the problem with Zinfandel, when you get uneven ripening, is winemakers have always had the tendency to to err on the side of over ripeness. And I could refer to that as addressing the symptom, not the problem. The symptom, when you have uneven ripening, is you have green flavors, right? You have some ripe flavors, some underripe flavors. So when you address the symptom, you err on the side of overripeness, because we'd rather have ripe jammy flavors than any vegetal or herbal flavors. Well, if you were addressing the problem, you would say, how do we get it to ripen homogenously so that we get true phenolic development at a uniform Brix level? And I believe to this day that what you taste in our wines is great terroir selection and impeccable farming. And I think one of the hallmark characteristics of our Zinfandels is that they have incredible tannin for the varietal, but they always have this freshness. There's an acid there. And again, when we can pick at a true Brix of 24.5, and yeah, we're still going to get some soak up, because Zinfandel is a thin-skinned varietal, but we're not soaking up to 28 or 30. And we're certainly not picking at 27 and hoping it only soaks up to 30. When you can pick at that true bricks at 24 and a half, and maybe you end up at 25 and a half, 26, your natural acids are going to be correspondingly higher. You're going to retain those fresh fruit flavors versus that kind of homogenized, overripe, jammy characteristic. And before I get too far down the rabbit hole about the wines, I want to say one of my wine epiphanies came in early 2000 when I was traveling through Europe, and I was spending in quite a bit of time in Burgundy. And I got to spend a couple of days specifically with Jacques Lardier. And Jacques was a winemaker at Louis Jadot. He was there for 40 years. His nickname is the Godfather of Burgundy because he was such an influential character and winemaker there. But I'll never forget, this was 2000. We had just bottled my first release. It was 1998 Zinfandel. I don't even think we had labels on it yet because we didn't get the labels in time. So everything was in shiners. So, I knew enough to know that when winemakers travel, you always bring wine with you. So very sheepishly, I present him as a thank you for all of his time and the tasting we had done with this bottle of Zin. And embarrassingly, he's like, "Oh, I love Zinfandel. We must open this." And I'm just like, "Oh my God, here's my first ever wine, and I'm with Jacques Lardier." So he opens the wine, and we're tasting it and smelling it. He's not saying anything, and I'm starting to sweat profusely. And all of a sudden, he just slams his hand down on the table. And in his heavy French accent, he says, "A raisin tastes like a raisin, tastes like a raisin." And I don't think I said anything, but I'm sure my facial expression just said, "Oh, fuck," like, what is happening here? And I mean, it turned out to be one of the most profound, certainly career-altering, career-shaping moments of my life. And we went on to have this 4-hour discussion. And before I go into the discussion, this is how he explained it. As he said, if you look at a Cabernet berry, a Zinfandel berry, and a raisin berry, or excuse me, a Pinot Noir berry, they look totally different, right? Different sizes, different colors, slightly different shapes, different thickness of skins, and they taste totally different. But if you look at a Cabernet raisin, a Zinfandel raisin, and a Pinot Noir raisin, they all look like raisins and they taste like raisins. And literally that oversimplification has been a guiding principle in the way that, we source grapes, the way that we make wine, what we deem to be a great vineyard site. And it's why our Zinfandels taste the way that they do. And it's something that, like I said, has really shaped my career. And it's a gross oversimplification, but a pretty poetic one at that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic experience. And like you said, working and spending time around those people really is what shapes your career. Probably not those viticulture classes you took with the VHS, although I'm sure you could go back to them if you need to.
I refuse to let my wife throw them out. And she's like, "We don't even have a way to play. We don't have a VHS player in our house." I'm like, "Nope, you can't throw the box out."
I'm with you on that. It's like history. Just for reference point for someone, a shoulder is, think of the main stem of a grape cluster. A shoulder is basically another stem kind of branching off right at the top there to form, as you said, a smaller cluster, although in this case, a fairly large cluster. I guess let's kind of maybe transition into, I guess Sonoma is a really big place to talk about, and we're not talking about all Sonoma. So these couple AVAs that the wines are coming out of today are out of Dry Creek Valley and Rockpile AVAs. And maybe you could talk about how each of those are kind of distinctive, maybe from one another, and maybe on a more macro level, how they kind of fit into Sonoma and what makes them special for you guys.
Absolutely. I tried to queue up a map. So if you guys will give me the share ability.
Let's see. Terrible at that. Hey, Pierce, you remember how to transfer that? Remember how to transfer that?
Not off the top of my head.
No,
I know it's weird on yours because you're on the iPad.
Yeah, hold on.
So it's different than whenever I have the view on the PC.
Okay.
well, I'll keep talking. If you guys
No, no,
figure it out, let
go
me know.
ahead.
There we go.
I changed you to the host, so you should be able to do that, and you just have to swap me back at the end.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to try to do this, and I'm going to say up front that I am not the most technologically, you know, literate person in the world.
Well, as you can see, neither are we.
Yeah.
So
So
there's
I'm
that.
gonna try and do this. So you guys probably going to see my screen for better or worse. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, it looks like yep, there we go. You're on it.
Okay. And now hopefully you have a map of Sonoma County in front of you.
Yep.
So I'm going to try and
Perfect.
zoom in. So this gives you an idea of Sonoma County at a whole. And if you look, you know, to the kind of northwest corner, you'll see Rockpile and Dry Creek Valley. And what's really unique about those two sub-AVAs is they overlap. You'll see areas like Fort Ross Seaview that is wholly contained within the Sonoma Coast, or Green Valley is wholly contained within the Russian River Valley. But it is fairly rare to have two AVAs overlap. And as you can probably tell, you know, Rockpile is basically an extension of, you know, Dry Creek Valley, but we'll get into what makes those, you know, very different. I heard Dave Raffinelli is one of the truly iconic wineries in Dry Creek Valley and makes great Zinfandel, give a great socioeconomic lesson in why Dry Creek Valley is so great for Zinfandel. And what his point was that when the Italians and Swiss immigrants who largely settled northern Sonoma County came here, the Swiss by and large had more money. And so the Swiss bought the valley floor land because it was always more fertile, right? That's where the water was, that's where all the silt had run off the hills. And the Italians were relegated to the hillsides because the land was less expensive and that's what they could afford. And what did they do on the hillsides? They did what they did back home. They started growing grapes. And it was because those vineyards in Dry Creek Valley were planted on the hillsides that, in my opinion, and certainly Dave's opinion, this day, why Dry Creek has such an incredible reputation for Zinfandel. And this is another great conversation point, because when you think about Zinfandel, there's this notion of old vines. Everyone loves to talk about old vine Zinfandel. And the question that I always pose to people is a vine good because it's old, or is it old because it's good? Mm-hmm. And I believe strongly that it's the latter, because if it produced shitty quality, it wouldn't be in the ground. I mean, let's face it, if you planted Zinfandel and the Zinfandel sucked, someone would have pulled it out and they either would have planted a different varietal or maybe they would have planted corn. And the same is true for corn. If you're trying to grow corn in soil and it doesn't grow well, you don't do it again. I mean, that's the definition of insanity, right? It's trying to do the same thing and expect a different result. So my point is that, you know, a vine doesn't necessarily have to be old to be good. But the reason that something is old is because it's been exceptional. And when you look at Dry Creek Valley, we have this preponderance of old vine Zinfandel because it got grown in the right place from day one. And it has been left in the ground because it produces outstanding quality. So we have this really kind of treasure in Dry Creek of all these old vines, this incredible heritage of this being a great place to grow Zinfandel. Now, what makes it a great place to grow Zinfandel? You know, Dry Creek Valley is a very narrow valley. And so when you think about, you know, what that means, it means that a higher percentage of your AVA is going to be on a hillside vineyard. Because if your valley floor, it doesn't matter if it's a mile wide at the base of the valley or a quarter mile wide, your hillside percentages are still, the hillsides are still the same, the percentages changes. And so we have a lot of really well-drained hillside vineyards in Dry Creek Valley where Zinfandel got planted. And that's the key. If you want to grow great Zinfandel, in my opinion, you have to grow it in well-drained soils. And so you'll hear a lot of people talk about finding those pockets of sand or gravel bars, or in our case, you know, largely hillsides. And it has to do with that berry size. Zinfandel has such a tendency to produce these huge berries that if you want to get concentration and help with uniformity of ripening, you have to produce a smaller berry size. And it helps with rot and a million other, you know, issues. And so in Dry Creek, we've got a lot of hillside vineyards. I love the fact that we get really different characteristics from different sides of the valley. Obviously, if you're on the eastern side of the valley facing west, you're going to get a lot more sun exposure. We tend to have a lot more volcanic influenced soils on the eastern side of the valley, where on the western side of the valley, that's basically the extent of the far reaches of the coastal range. And so you have this really weird confluence of rock sources and the coastal range, everything from, part of the upturned Pacific plate that got pushed up when the San Andreas pushed this up, to sedimentary flow. So we have an incredible diversity of soil type in Dry Creek Valley. From you were mentioning that Zinfandel doesn't do really well in Washington. And I would say, it is a finicky ripener. I mean, you have to get it, it has to be warm enough to get it ripe, but you can't be too warm because, again, those skids will just disintegrate on you. And, Dry Creek feeds into Russian River. And so, literally the Dry Creek Valley just goes right into the Russian River Valley. We don't have the volume of water they have in Russian River Valley. So we don't get as much fog, but we get enough fog to elongate the growing season, but we don't get as much to make it problematic with rot. So I feel like we have the absolute perfect environment where our average daily high for the month of July in Dry Creek Valley is 87 degrees, and our average daily low is like 59. So we have this beautiful diurnal shift, helps us retain acid, elongates the growing season. We get just enough fog, but typically the fog burns off at 9 o'clock. So it really is a perfect storm. And like I said earlier, I don't care if we're talking about Cabernet, Chardonnay, Zinfandel, Pinot Noir. If you want to grow a great wine, and I say grow great wine, it's not a misnomer, I mean that. You have to grow the perfect varietal in the perfect place. And I think Zinfandel really is suited for Dry Creek Valley.
Yeah, that's definitely been my experience. From a standpoint of the Jack's cabin with rock pile, when you're looking at, I guess, at making single vineyard designates, like, is that something that you just traditionally started out doing, or is that something where you said, okay, well, now I see the individual fingerprint when I was going to make all these blends and I want to be able to show that to the world? Or has that, like, how did that evolve for you as a program?
Our single vineyard rock pile wines started as single vineyards from the word go, from day one. And, we have a pretty amazing history in rock pile. And let me talk about the rock pile AVA really quick, because it'll give you a little bit of context. So rock pile is one of only 5 appellations in America that is delineated by elevation. And, just to give you some perspective, Dry Creek Valley is a relatively small AVA in the grand scheme of things of Sonoma County, because it only has 9,000 acres of vineyard. But Russian River Valley, Alexander Valley each have over 15,000 acres of vineyard. Sonoma Valley, about 13,000 acres of vineyard. Put this in perspective. Rock Pile has 200 acres of vineyard. Part of the reason Rock Pile is so small is because it is defined by elevation. And when you think about most AVAs, they carry the name Valley for a reason. Sonoma Valley, Russian River Valley, Alexander Valley, Dry Creek Valley. It's because the AVA is defined by the watershed. If the water runs into the valley, it's part of the AVA. Rock Pile is almost exactly the opposite. It's defined by watershed, but it means if the water runs off of the ridge into Lake Sonoma, it is part of the rock pile AVA. And it really is the lake that defines the rock pile AVA. And if you remember in the story earlier, I talked about my family losing 3,300 acres to eminent domain. We lost our property to the Army Corps of Engineers so that the Army Corps of Engineers could build Lake Sonoma. And we had absolutely no idea at the time that this man-made lake would create one of the most distinct grape growing regions in the United States. The map didn't really do a great job of showing the size of the lake, in perspective to the AVA. But Lake Sonoma is about 2,500 surface acres, and it's shaped just like a horseshoe. So when they dammed it up the convergence of Dry Creek and Warm Springs. And so the lake flooded in the shape of a horseshoe. Well, that horseshoe essentially defines the rock pile AVA. That one ridge that runs down the middle is the rock pile AVA. I mentioned that Lake Sonoma is 2,500 surface acres. It's also 240 feet deep at the base of the dam. It is an incredibly deep body of water. When you have a deep body of water that has that much volume, it means you have a very cold body of water. And that temperature is the key component, because as the air heats up in the summer and fall and the lake temperature stays cold, it creates an inversion layer. And that inversion layer sucks the fog down. And I mentioned earlier that Rockpile is one of only 5 AVAs in America that has an elevation requirement. You have to be above 800 feet in elevation on that singular ridge line to be a part of the Rockpile AVA, because there is absolutely no fog during the growing season above 800 feet. And that is the ultimate point of distinction, because you can imagine with this huge body of water surrounding the AVA, you have a very moderate climate, very temperate climate. Our average daily highs are lower than Dry Creek Valley, and our average daily lows are higher. So we have less of a diurnal shift. We are only 11 miles from the ocean in Rockpile. So again, further moderates the climate, yet you have no moisture in the form of fog. We often joke, it's almost like cheating. We basically, I'm not saying that we don't have to use sulfur up there, but if we make 3 sulfur applications to help control, botrytis or rot down on the valley floor, we maybe make 1 up in Rockpile. We do not have the disease pressure up there because we only have 52 acres planted, in our 700 acres of property that's left. And then when you consider that the Rockpile AVA encompasses 15,000 acres of land, but there's only 200 acres planted because of the elevation requirements, because of the slopes, you just don't have a monoculture of grapes. So it's such an incredible place to grow grapes, and it produces this very distinctive style. So back to your original question, did we always know we were going to make single vineyard wines from Rockpile? Yes. And really, it started out more as an homage to my family's history. And when you think about the fact that my family has been farming this dirt for 7 generations and 153 years contiguously, that was something that we really wanted to celebrate. Now, we didn't have a perfect idea early on of what those individual nuances of the Jack's Cabin block versus Rockpile Ridge versus Cemetery versus Westfall, what all those were going to be. And some of that has evolved with time, but we always knew that we really wanted to celebrate that diversity, because while you have this incredible place to grow grapes in Rockpile, we have elevations that range from 900 feet to 1,400 feet in elevation. We literally have every conceivable sun exposure you can manage. We have slopes that are as slight as 10 degrees up to 40 degrees. And we have 18 different registered soil types that we're growing grapes in. So we knew that we had ample amount of diversity to truly make these incredible expressions of terroir, these incredible expressions of place. And so Jack's Cabin, we really, that was one of our first single vineyard wines. And I'll screen share again, because I hope that the photo will come up. Nope, don't want to see my wife in a bikini. Let's see, I'm going to try that again. I had it queued up, but I don't know how to.
As you said, technology is not my strong suit either.
Yeah, no, it's not my strong suit. Let's see. Like you, I am on my iPad, and I'm not always. I don't know why I can't get that photo to come up right now. I had it queued up beforehand, but the screen share is not wanting to let me do that. Anyways, Jack's Cabin is just such a it's a really neat site, and people often ask us, where do all these names come from? Where do the names like Jack's Cabin and Cemetery, Madrone Spring, Westfall Ridge, Independence? Well, the names come from the fact that my family, as I said, we were farmers, we were ranchers, we did whatever we needed to do to put food on the family table. And even though we've grown grapes contiguously since the very beginning, it was never a major source of income for us until the 1960s. What put food on the family table was raising merino sheep for wool. But when you had the original ranch that was 4,000 acres and needed to go out and check on the sheep, you couldn't say go out to the back 40 and check on the sheep, because there was a lot of back 40s. You couldn't say go out to the hillside and check on the sheep, because there was a lot of hillsides. So it was really important for us to have geographic descriptors to describe where the sheep would typically congregate. And the where the sheep would typically congregate was either areas where there was water or areas where there was feed. And so a conversation may have been between my great grandfather and my grandfather. Hey, I saw the sheep at the cemetery yesterday. It looked like they were headed to the Madrone Spring. If you don't see them there, maybe check Jack's cabin. Well, now 100 years later, we're growing grapes on these sites because these were some of the open hillsides where the sheep used to feed. And so it may sound like a funny story or it may sound a little bit crazy, but for us, it's like, how do you ignore 150 years of history that we have on the site when this site has been called Jack's Cabin, for that long? So yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm going to try and do this again I'm going to try and screen share, and I'm just going to do my screen versus the photos. So let's see. You guys seeing photos right now?
We are.
All right. So it actually worked. So this is Jack's Cabin. This is a great site. In fact, this is actually the Buck Pasture Vineyard. And what you're looking down to is 2 blocks, one of blocks, which is Jack's Cabin. And I love this picture because it gives you some perspective on the slope, the diversity of terroir, the drainage is up there. So even though we're looking at not more than about 7 acres of vineyard, you can see 3 very distinct blocks. I don't know if you can see my cursor. But
yeah, we can.
So this block right here in the foreground, this is Malbec. Right here, this block that kind of flows right there, that's what we call the lower pond block. This block right here is the water trough block. And right over here, you can see the tip of Jack's Cabin. So there's actually, I lied, there's 4 blocks in this tiny little snippet. But we have all this block separation because we have different drainages, different slopes, different soil types. And this is the diversity that Rockpile gives you, yet you still have that commonality of no fog, very moderate climate, very arid. This also gives you an idea of the influence of the lake. And even though it looks like a river, you got to understand we're a long ways away from the river and the lake, and it winds around our vineyard. And so that gives you kind of a broad picture of Rockpile. This is a great picture of a Zinfandel bunch. And it shows you just the nature, how challenging Zinfandel is. That's how the uneven pedicel length, that some of those berries you can tell, like these berries right in here, they're never going to see the light of day. And more than likely, those berries will rot out as soon as they start to develop sugar by no fault of the grower at all. And you look at how, all this in here is even before the bunch is fully developed. It just gives you an idea of how challenging Zinfandel can be. I was hoping I had.
Totally mental, man. Like there's no other varietal that does that to you.
It is a bastard. So this is a similar shot. Now I'm up a little bit higher above the Malbec. So here's Malbec again. Here's Lower Pond. Here's Water Trough. And now you can see Jack's Cabin. And Jack's Cabin is one of our sites that is probably the least stressed. So more homogenization of soil than some of the other blocks. It only gets up to about 15 degrees slope. And one of the defining characteristics of Jack's Cabin is that the vineyard is orientated north-south. And one of the things, you may not notice it from the naked eye, but if I point it out to you, I know you guys will appreciate it. With all of these steep slopes in this vineyard, is there anything that jumps out to you?
That way, of course.
There's no terraces, not a single terrace.
Yeah.
And there's 2 reasons for that. First of all is our intense reverence for this land. And, look, everyone does their own thing, and I'm not here to judge, but the way we approach it is it's our job to be great caretakers of this land for the next generation. And God only knows what the best use of this land will be for the next generation. And by not terracing this site, or some would call raping the land, we could go here tomorrow. We could pull out every single grape stake and every single grapevine. And when the grass grew back, you would never know there was a vineyard there. And that ensures that maybe in future generations, we'll be back to raising livestock there. Maybe we'll plant olives. Maybe we'll do something totally off the ball. Maybe we'll be growing pot up there. I mean, who knows? But at least we're giving ourselves the ability to do that. And the second reason, and more specific to this conversation, is again, our reverence for the site and site specific wines. And if God gave us a southwestern facing slope, then guess what? That's what we need to plant, because this slope is going to have a very different characteristic than this slope. And right here, when you have this little, kind of elbow and all of a sudden a totally different drainage, just like you have right here, that is the essence of terroir, those tiny little micro nuances that give you a different characteristic. And instead of shying away from this north-south sun exposure that we get out of Jack's Cabin, we embrace it. And when you taste that wine, you get that. Yes, of course, you're going to get some of the structure and acid that is a hallmark of Rockpile, but there is also a ripeness to this vineyard site that we don't always see in other Rockpile wines. And that ripeness comes from the fact that the eastern side of the canopy does not get a lot of sun exposure because of the slope up here. And obviously, as the sun's coming up in the morning, the sun exposure isn't as intense. But that western side of the canopy gets bathed in sun all day long. And so the truth is, you're going to get some degree of uneven ripening. And even with modified viticulture techniques like a modified flop on our vineyard, that is a characteristic of the site, and we embrace it. And you have this beautiful dichotomy in this wine where there is a savory ripe component, but yet you have this acid from the eastern side of the canopy. And I just love how not only this wine, but all of our wines really show those micro nuances of terroir, micro nuances of place, and Rockpile, let's face it, gives us the ability to do that very easily.
Gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a super, super, super cool spot.
Maybe one of the most striking AVAs I've been to, and even globally, just
it's a really unique spot for sure.
And who would have thought that, again, it truly is a man-made AVA. And it's not to say that Rockpile wouldn't be a great place to grow grapes if that lake wasn't there. It would just be very different.
right.
Yeah. Well, I love that it's man-made, but it wasn't with any intention towards the, viticulture side, right? Like it's completely incidental, but it ended up being a really unique place to grow grapes. And it was guys like you who kind of figured that out. So
we call that the very minute silver lining. Trust me, I think if you gave us the choice of having the Rockpile AVA or having our 3,000 acres back, we'd probably take the 3,000 acres back.
I would too.
People who wouldn't make that deal.
Yeah. So that's Rockpile. I feel like we talked about Dry Creek, but didn't talk about the Dry Creek wine. I'll hit that really briefly. Dry Creek Zin is a 19, so obviously we're dealing with two different vintages. One of the really unique things about all of our vineyards in Rockpile is, as you saw on the map, our vineyards all overlap the Dry Creek AVA. So it's interesting. A Dry Creek vineyard is not necessarily Rockpile, but a Rockpile vineyard can be Dry Creek based on the elevation. So the huge advantage for us is we make 7 different single vineyard Rockpile Zinfandels. Anything that does not make it into our single vineyard blend, whether it be a barrel component or an experimental lot that we're working with, we can declassify and use in our Dry Creek Zin. So we typically have about 30 to 35% Rockpile fruit in our Dry Creek Zin. In 2019, that number is a little bit higher. If you looked at the tasting notes, we used 15% Petite Syrah in the blend in 2019. And the only place we grow Petite Syrah is in Rockpile. So not only do you have all that great Zinfandel that we used in the blend, but we also used more Rockpile Petite Syrah than we normally would. And then we're really fortunate to source fruit from all over Dry Creek Valley. When I say all over, literally the northern extreme, the southern extreme, the eastern extreme, and the western extreme. And it's the one wine that I make that's not 100% estate. And we take such pride in that, because here I've bragged about how great a job my brothers do farming, but it doesn't matter how good of a farmer you are if you don't have that perfect piece of ground to farm. And, we lost all of our old vines to eminent domain. And per that discussion earlier of why are vines old, they're old because they're damn good. So when I can go to these fourth and fifth generation neighbors of ours and buy 85-year-old head pruned dry farm Zinfandel, that's worth its weight in gold. And so we're so fortunate to have amazing relationships with these other growers in the valley, and we get access to some beautiful, beautiful fruit. And, this is always the wine that I'm most proud of. I mean, you saw that picture of Rockpile. If we can't make great wine from that site, then I need to find a new job. The Dry Creek Zen is a much more artistic expression because we typically have about 12 different vineyard sources, including a lot of estate fruit that goes into it, but all these other small grower blocks that go into it. And there's just that artistry in winemaking where you have all these different components, these different aspects that we get to make this really stunning, consistent wine year in and year out. At 19, I mean, I am just giddy about the vintage overall for Zinfandel. And this is a really youthful wine, truth be told. I mean, it's only been in bottle now for about 4 months, but you see the potential it has. It has the ripeness, it has the structure. I think that they love the ripeness of Zinfandel, but without being overripe. It has the signature structure that people come to expect of our wines. But the difference to me is this wine has an inherent richness, and it's not a richness, from overwhelming oak. That is the signature of the vintage. There's this viscosity, this texture, this richness, this creaminess of the vintage. And I go back and I look at, you asked the question about those early vintages and how we struggled. And I think the main reason that winemakers struggle early in their career is they have no perspective. They don't have that historic knowledge, that's just invaluable. They always say there's no replication for experience, right? And so when I look at a vintage like 2019, and as we're going through, the summer months and the ripening period, all I'm ever thinking about anymore is, what does this remind me of? Is this more like 13 or 14, or maybe I see some similarities to 2009? What did I do in 2009 that worked? And what did I do in 2009 that didn't work? And you take all this institutional knowledge and you impart that into every new vintage that we experience. And 19, was a warmer vintage, which I mentioned earlier that Zinfandel loves a little bit of heat, but we didn't have the heat spikes like I talked about in 2000. It was warmer, but fairly moderate in terms of just average daily highs were higher without any crazy heat spikes. So I love that inherent ripeness. But again, I think we did a better job managing our tannins, which allowed some of that richness and depth to come through in the wine. And, we're just getting into our 19 releases now. And I mean, they're spectacular. It is just such an awesome, awesome vintage for Zinfandel.
That's cool. I'll look forward to hopefully trying all of them at some point. I really enjoy this wine. I mean, as you said, it does have a richness. It has a complexity to it that I really enjoy. It's got, it's not just primary fruit, which is my critique of a lot of Zinfandels. But it has, more of your chocolate and kind of some of those notes that come through. I just really nice wine. Really.
Well, I think
really nicely.
Clay, I think like you were saying too, like you guys have a really distinct profile with your tannin structure.
Yeah.
With your Zinfandels, and a lot of wineries that make a lot of Zinfandel, I find that it's a little bit lacking. And I really appreciate that extra added bit of structure that tends to come from you guys.
It's probably one of the most consistent critiques that we get is people tell us our Zins are too tannic, or you gotta take the critique. I mean, you gotta be able to stand the heat if you want to be a chef. But my common response is like, have you ever been to Rockpile? Have you ever seen Rockpile? Because if this wine didn't have tannins, then I would be doing something wrong. I would not be doing my sole job as a winemaker to express the date and place on the bottle. And when you have, the lack of water retention we have, the lack of atmospheric moisture, because there's no fog in Rockpile, and you get these small berries and you loose bunches that get lots of sun exposure. We get, quercetin out the yin yang. Our tannin levels are, that of Cabernet. That's what Rockpile is. And so, it's managing. That's probably the biggest improvement that I have seen in myself as a winemaker and, our winemaking staff is managing tannins better, because trust me, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing in winemaking.
Yeah,
Always.
noticed that. I mean, I think, maybe that you get that critique, but on the total flip side of that, there's so few food friendels, and this is one that you can actually eat with some serious food. And I think that's why you see a lot of people undervalue Zinfandel, is because you don't have that. You're lacking the structure. Chefs don't want to work with it. And if more chefs had the opportunity to work with wines that had the structure, you wouldn't get that reputation in the same way. So that would be my argument against their argument or critique.
We do. You guys will have to try and come down for this. I know it gets close to harvest, so it's a difficult timing. But every year we put on a huge fundraiser for a cause that's very near and dear to my heart, which is the charity we support. But we also created this event to put Zinfandel on a pedestal, and we call it Project Zen. And, we bring together 21 of the best Zinfandel producers, in the United States, and pair them with incredible chefs, chefs from all over the country that come in for this event, because that's the common response we get, is that, and I agree wholeheartedly that Zinfandel just does not get the respect, because there's so many Zinfandels that don't pair well with food. And let's face it, wine has been an accompaniment to food since its origins hundreds of years ago. They are meant to complement each other. And when you have, these really high alcohol, overripe, over extracted sweet wines, they don't complement food. So if you ever want to come down to a great Zinfandel food and wine event, it's called Project Zen. We host it in August every year, and it is just an incredible collection of Zinfandel. I mean, literally, you will never find these 21 producers ever under one roof, because most of them don't do ZAP. Most of them don't belong to family winemakers. Most of them don't, so you're just getting all of these little cult tiny producers together. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
That sounds
definitely.
amazing.
Definitely love to get the info. My boss won't be happy, but I'll be there. Okay, well, I mean, I think that's probably a great place to wrap it up, unless you have some more questions, Chris.
No, I mean, Clay did a phenomenal job of. Yeah, no, he has it down. This was great. All my questions have been answered before I could ask them. So
good. Like I said, it's hard to. Anytime you can say you've been doing anything for 23 years, it makes you feel a little bit old. So, I've been doing it. I've been doing it a while.
On the plus side, you speak like you have done it and you know it. So
thank you.
Good.
Just remember, those 23 years go fast, and in wine, how many chances you get? Maybe another 23.
Isn't that the truth? I did a really cool tasting the other day with there was a couple winemakers, a brewer, and we were all blindfolded. And this tasting was being led by a flavor expert who is blind, legally blind since birth. He has his own brand of spices, and it was just such a phenomenal expression. And we got into the discussion with the brewer, the master brewer, about the notion that man makes beer and God makes wine. You get, I mean, yes, I'm not talking about being an intern and traveling around the world and trying to get 3 harvests in a year, but you get one chance, and that's it. One chance. And I think one of the things that's made our winery successful is, I will always be a recovering athlete. And Emma, who was promoted full-time to winemaker in 2019, so she is the day-to-day winemaker now. Emma was a much more successful college athlete than I was. She was an All-American water polo player. Our enologist, who was with us for 5 years, was a college baseball player. Is this inherent competitiveness and not being afraid to try to push the envelope, because even though you only get one chance per year, you got to be willing to take that 5-ton lot and split it up into 5 1-ton fermentations and try things. And you're trying it based on, scientific methods, right? Something that didn't work before, or something you felt you could improve on. But I think so many people, trial and error is stifled in winemaking because you only get that one shot. Where I was giving the brewer a hard time, I'm like, shit, man, you screw this up, you could do it again in an hour later. You get to do it again tomorrow. I mean, there's no risk,
Right. No,
That's very true.
We screw this up and our family doesn't eat,
That's true. It's the truth. Makes it hard to go out, put yourself out there. But like you said, you got to do it. At some level, you got to do it.
Got to always strive to get better. I tell my kids, man, the two things you control is your attitude and your effort. You approach every day with a great attitude and a great effort, and constantly, you should always be your own greatest competitor. You always want to be doing better. Just get 1% better every day. And if you have that approach, I think, great things will happen. You got to start with the good raw ingredients, but that's just part of the equation.
Yeah, that's good advice. All right,
Well,
all right.
man, I cannot thank you guys enough for having me and supporting the wines and getting them out there. I know you guys know it all too well that for, when you're trying to, build a brand, especially a small brand in this day and age, that every little, endorsement, every little, pat on the back means the world. So thank you guys so much for having me. Thank you for supporting the wines. And I hope we can do this again sometime, or, get you guys down here and we'll do something down here.
Yeah. Likewise, if you
absolutely.
ever find yourself in Washington, give us a ring.
Yeah.
I definitely will. I think we're all long overdue for some hearty travel. So yeah,
Definitely.
No doubt.
All right.
No doubt. I'll have you throw me back over.
Yep.
Maybe I can do it. I don't know if I can do it. Nope. I'll have you just go to participants and throw me back over as the host. And that was great. That was
It was excellent.
one of my favorite there.
Mm-hmm.
Make host. There we go. I think you got it.
Perfect.
Perfect. All right, guys, I'm going to sign out and go put my kids to bed. But thank you again. It's been a pleasure.